Breaking news out of Ottawa, and what just unfolded in the past 48 hours represents one of the most dramatic diplomatic breakdowns in modern North American security history. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has rejected a $740 billion border security partnership with the United States in what analysts are calling a calculated political gamble that could reshape continental migration policy for decades. We're not talking about minor disagreements over implementation details. We're talking about the collapse of the most comprehensive cross-border security framework ever proposed, $300 million in immediate enforcement funding frozen, and border communities from Washington state to Maine now facing an unprecedented surge in unauthorized crossings that experts warn could exceed 200,000 people in the next 90 days alone. In the next 18 minutes, I'm going to break down exactly how Trump's border security proposal triggered this international crisis, which American communities are already overwhelmed by the fallout, and why security analysts warn this could mark a permanent fracture in the world's longest undefended border. The question everyone's asking is this: how did we go from integrated continental security to each nation fortifying its own borders against the other? Let me paint you the picture of what just happened. On January 24, 2025, Mark Carney stood before Parliament in Ottawa and delivered what amounts to a complete repudiation of American border security policy. His exact words were that Canada would not become, quote, an enforcement arm for policies that contradict our values and international obligations. The proposal he rejected was staggering in scope, $740 billion over 5 years. Joint patrol zones extending 200 miles on both sides of the border, shared detention facilities, harmonized asylum processing, real-time intelligence sharing beyond anything the two nations have ever attempted. And it gets worse. This didn't happen in a vacuum. This is the culmination of 6 months of increasingly tense negotiations that began last July, when the Trump administration first floated the idea of what they called comprehensive northern border integration. To understand how we got here, you need to know that the US-Canada border has historically been one of the most cooperative security relationships in the world. According to the Wilson Center, bilateral law enforcement coordination has prevented an estimated 92% of attempted irregular crossings since 2001. We're talking about 5,500 miles of border managed through trust and information sharing rather than walls and military presence. By December 2024, that cooperation had already started fracturing. Migration flows through Canada had increased by 417% compared to the previous year. According to Customs and Border Protection data, apprehensions along the northern border jumped from 8,300 in 2023 to 42,000 in 2024. The pressure was building. Then came the trigger event. On January 15, 2025, Trump announced the Border Security Partnership in a primetime address, framing it as, quote, the most generous offer ever extended to a trading partner. The deal included massive funding for Canadian border infrastructure, advanced surveillance technology, personnel training programs, but buried in the 500-page proposal were requirements that Canada fundamentally alter its asylum and refugee policies to match American standards. The Canadian government would be required to immediately deport asylum seekers from what the agreement called, quote, non-priority countries. They would have to adopt U.S. visa restrictions for dozens of nations. They would need to allow American immigration officials to conduct interviews and enforcement actions on Canadian soil. Carney's government reviewed the proposal for 9 days. On January 24th, he delivered his answer. No. The market reaction in security and defense sectors was immediate. Shares in border technology firms dropped 11%. Cross-border logistics companies saw their stock values decline by $8.3 billion in a single trading day. State governors from Montana, North Dakota, Minnesota, and New York issued emergency declarations within hours. But here's what makes this different from previous diplomatic tensions. This isn't a disagreement over tariff rates or environmental standards. This is about whether two sovereign nations can maintain fundamentally different approaches to migration while sharing the world's longest border. And the answer, according to what we're seeing unfold right now, appears to be no. So how exactly does cross-border migration enforcement work when neighboring nations have opposing policies? And why is this breakdown so catastrophic for American border security? Let me break this down in simple terms. Think of border security like a water management system. If you and your neighbor share a property line and you build a dam on your side but your neighbor doesn't maintain theirs, water doesn't just stop at the property line. It flows around, it finds gaps, it exploits every weakness in the system. That's exactly what's happening along the US-Canada border right now. For decades, both nations invested in what security experts call layered enforcement. It meant that someone trying to enter North America irregularly faced multiple checkpoints, multiple screening processes, multiple opportunities to be identified and processed appropriately. A person denied entry to the United States might travel to Canada and attempt entry there, but Canadian officials had access to US databases, shared intelligence, coordinated responses. The system wasn't perfect, but it created what researchers at the Migration Policy Institute call deterrence through cooperation. Now let me show you what happens when that cooperation collapses. Under the proposed agreement, the United States would have invested $200 billion in the first year alone on northern border infrastructure. That included 3,000 new Border Patrol agents specifically assigned to the Canadian frontier, 47 new processing facilities, advanced biometric screening at every official crossing point, drone surveillance across remote sectors. The expectation was that Canada would match these investments and, more critically, would align its admission and asylum policies so that people denied entry to one country couldn't simply cross into the other and try again. When Carney rejected the deal, he didn't just say no to American money. He signaled that Canada would maintain its own migration standards regardless of US policy. According to Canada's Immigration and Refugee Board, that means continuing to accept asylum claims from countries the US considers low priority. It means maintaining different visa requirements. It means in practice that the northern border becomes what migration experts call a policy arbitrage opportunity. Here's how this plays out in real numbers. The Department of Homeland Security estimates that in 2024, approximately 68,000 people entered Canada legally on tourist or temporary visas from countries that restrict travel to the United States. Of those, Border Patrol estimates that between 12 and 18,000 eventually crossed into the United States at unofficial border points. That's under the old system with cooperation. Security analysts at the Rand Corporation project that without bilateral coordination, that number could increase to 75,000 in 2025 and potentially exceed 120,000 by 2026. And it gets worse. The Trump administration's response to Carney's rejection was to immediately announce unilateral enforcement measures. On January 25th, just one day after Carney's refusal, Homeland Security deployed an additional 1,200 Border Patrol agents to northern sectors. They activated National Guard units in 6 states. They installed vehicle barriers and surveillance equipment at 43 previously unmonitored crossing points in Montana, North Dakota, and Minnesota alone. But here's the kicker. None of these measures address the fundamental problem. You cannot secure 5,500 miles of border through unilateral action when the country on the other side is actively maintaining different admission standards. It's not that Canadian officials are encouraging illegal migration. It's that their definition of legal entry and asylum protection differs from American policy. And that difference creates systematic gaps that determined migrants will exploit. Let me be crystal clear about what this means for enforcement. When someone crosses the Canadian border into the United States outside an official port of entry, they've committed a violation of US immigration law. But if they first entered Canada legally under Canadian standards, they're not violating Canadian law. That means Canadian law enforcement has no grounds to prevent their departure. American law enforcement can only respond after they've already crossed. We've created a one-way valve where pressure builds on the Canadian side and releases into American territory, and there's no mechanism to stop it without Canadian cooperation. According to internal Border Patrol documents obtained through Freedom of Information requests, interdiction rates along the northern border have historically been 67% in cooperative zones, where Canadian and American officers coordinate. In non-cooperative zones, that rate drops to 31%. We're about to turn the entire northern border into a non-cooperative zone. Multiply these systemic problems across 5,500 miles, and you start to understand the scale of what border communities are facing. Let me introduce you to three people whose lives are being upended by this diplomatic breakdown. Sarah Mitchell is a Border Patrol agent based in Pembina, North Dakota. She's 42 years old, 14-year veteran of CBP, and until 3 weeks ago, her sector processed an average of 11 unauthorized crossings per month. In the 7 days since Carney's rejection, her team has apprehended 83 people. That's a 636% increase. Sarah told local reporters that her station, designed for a staff of 19 agents covering a 112-mile sector, now has 12 agents on duty because 7 were reassigned to emergency deployment in Texas. She's working 16-hour shifts. The processing facility has capacity for 18 detainees. They currently have 41 people in holding, sleeping on floors, waiting days for transfer to larger facilities that are themselves overwhelmed. Sarah's 48-year-old husband has stage 3 colon cancer. She's missed 2 of his chemotherapy appointments in the past week because her station can't spare the personnel for her to take leave. She earns $72,000 annually. The overtime she's now working is technically compensated, but the agency is 6 months behind on overtime payment processing. She's facing a choice between being present for her husband's medical crisis and abandoning her post during what her supervisor calls a national security emergency. Her situation isn't unique. It's the new normal for 6,000 Border Patrol agents suddenly responsible for a frontier that went from cooperative to contested overnight. Then there's Michael Chen, who owns a cross-border logistics company in Buffalo, New York. His business moves automotive parts between manufacturing facilities in Ontario and assembly plants in Michigan and Ohio. Annual revenue of $19 million. 47 employees. For 23 years, the US-Canada border has been what Michael calls frictionless for commercial traffic. Trusted trader programs meant his trucks cleared customs in an average of 12 minutes. Since January 25th, average crossing times have increased to 4 hours and 17 minutes. His drivers are sitting in queues that stretch for miles. Perishable goods are spoiling. Just-in-time delivery schedules that manufacturers depend on are collapsing. And it gets worse for Michael, because the US has deployed additional inspection resources to focus on irregular migration. They've reduced staffing at commercial crossing points. His company has already lost 2 major contracts because he can't guarantee delivery windows anymore. He's projecting a 41% revenue decline in the first quarter of 2025 if conditions don't improve. He's already laid off 9 employees. The remaining staff has seen their hours cut by 30%. Michael is 56 years old. He remortgaged his house 3 years ago to invest in fleet expansion based on projected growth in cross-border trade. He now owes $430,000 on a property worth $380,000 in current market conditions. He can't sell the business because its value has collapsed. He can't maintain current operations because the border dysfunction makes his service unreliable. He's trapped in a situation created by diplomatic decisions he had no influence over and no protection against. Now consider Jennifer Okoye, a social worker in Plattsburgh, New York. She's 34 years old, works for a nonprofit that provides services to asylum seekers and refugees. Her caseload has exploded from 23 families to 96 families in 2 weeks. These are people who crossed from Canada, turned themselves in to Border Patrol, were processed and released pending immigration hearings, and now need housing, medical care, education for children, employment assistance. Jennifer's organization operates on a budget of $1.2 million annually, funded partly by state grants and partly by private donations. That budget was calculated based on historical migration patterns. It's now completely inadequate. The organization is spending $47,000 per week on emergency housing alone. At current rates, they'll be insolvent by mid-March. Jennifer herself is working 70 to 80 hours per week. She has a master's degree in social work and earns $48,000 annually. She's seen things in the past 2 weeks that will stay with her forever. A family of 4 from Venezuela who walked 11 miles in -15-degree weather because they were told the border was, quote, open now. a pregnant woman from Colombia who went into premature labor in CBP custody and delivered in a Border Patrol facility without medical staff, children with frostbite, adults with hypothermia, people who risked everything based on information networks that spread the news of the diplomatic breakdown faster than any government communication could counter it. Jennifer knows that most of these families have legitimate asylum claims. She also knows that the system designed to process those claims is completely overwhelmed. Hearing dates are being scheduled for 2028. That means 3 years in legal limbo. 3 years where these families can't work legally, can't access most public services, can't plan their lives. And Jennifer is the one trying to help them survive that limbo with resources that ran out days ago. Multiply Sarah's story, Michael's story, Jennifer's story by thousands, and you begin to understand what this diplomatic breakdown actually means in human terms. According to the National Immigration Forum, communities within 50 miles of the northern border are home to 12.3 million Americans. Those communities are about to experience sustained pressure that most of them have never encountered and have no infrastructure to handle. Experts across the security and policy spectrum are sounding alarms about where this situation leads if it continues on its current trajectory. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who directs the North American Security Program at the Council on Foreign Relations, told reporters that we are witnessing, quote, the unraveling of 70 years of continental security architecture. According to her analysis, the US-Canada security partnership has been based on the fundamental assumption that both nations benefit from aligned policies and shared enforcement. When that alignment breaks down, she warns, you don't just lose efficiency, you lose the ability to distinguish between routine migration and genuine security threats. Intelligence sharing becomes politicized. Routine law enforcement cooperation becomes a bargaining chip. The border becomes, in her words, a front line rather than a cooperative boundary. The Center for Immigration Studies, approaching from a more restrictive policy perspective, warns of different but equally serious consequences. Their analysis projects that without Canadian cooperation, the US would need to deploy between 18,000 and 22,000 additional Border Patrol agents to the northern frontier to maintain current interdiction rates. That's a 130 to 160% increase in northern border staffing. At current pay scales and support costs, that represents $15 to $19 billion in annual personnel expenses. And even with that investment, geography works against enforcement. The northern border includes vast stretches of forest, mountain ranges, and water boundaries that make comprehensive surveillance extraordinarily difficult without cooperative intelligence from the Canadian side. The Brookings Institution released an analysis on January 26th that focuses on the diplomatic implications. According to their researchers, Carney's rejection represents what they call a fundamental reassessment of Canada's geopolitical position. For decades, Canadian foreign policy has balanced sovereignty with pragmatic accommodation of American security concerns. This decision signals a shift toward asserting independence, even when it creates friction with the United States. The analysis warns that this has implications far beyond migration. Trade negotiations, defense cooperation, intelligence sharing, environmental policy, all of these areas depend on the assumption of aligned interests. When Canada demonstrates willingness to accept economic and diplomatic costs in order to maintain policy independence, it creates uncertainty across the entire bilateral relationship. Meanwhile, analysts at the Migration Policy Institute are focused on the humanitarian consequences. Their January report projects that irregular crossings along the northern border could result in 40 to 60 deaths in 2025, primarily from exposure during winter months. They document increasing reliance on human smuggling networks that charge between $8,000 and $15,000 per person to facilitate crossings in remote areas. These networks, previously minor factors in northern border migration, are rapidly professionalizing and expanding capacity. Law enforcement officials in Montana and Minnesota report increasing evidence of organized smuggling operations that didn't exist 6 months ago. And here's what really concerns analysts across the spectrum. This is just the beginning. In the next 30 to 90 days, we're likely to see continued increases in unauthorized crossings as word spreads through migrant networks that Canadian entry requirements remain more accessible than American ones. Border patrol sectors will continue operating in crisis mode. Processing facilities will remain overwhelmed. Local communities will face mounting costs for services they're legally required to provide. In the 6 to 12-month timeframe, analysts warn about secondary effects. Increased migration pressure leads to more aggressive enforcement. More aggressive enforcement leads to more confrontations, more use of force incidents, more litigation. Relations between border communities and federal law enforcement deteriorate. The political pressure builds for even more restrictive policies. But here's what really keeps security experts up at night: the permanent consequences. Once you break the cooperative framework that took 70 years to build, you don't just snap your fingers and rebuild it. Trust between federal agencies on both sides has been damaged. Intelligence sharing relationships have been politicized. The assumption of aligned interests has been shattered. According to former Homeland Security officials, even if a future administration wanted to restore the partnership, it would take years of sustained diplomatic effort, and that's assuming both nations want to restore it. If Canadian voters see Carney's stance as politically successful, future Canadian leaders will have little incentive to make concessions. If American voters see this as Canadian betrayal, future American leaders will face domestic pressure to treat Canada more like an adversarial neighbor than a trusted ally. We could be witnessing a permanent shift in how North America manages continental security. The US-Canada border could transform from the world's longest undefended border to something more resembling the fortified frontiers that characterize most international boundaries. Let's recap the 3 critical points here. First, who's paying the real price for this diplomatic breakdown? It's not politicians in Ottawa or Washington, it's people like Sarah Mitchell working 16-hour shifts while her husband battles cancer. It's business owners like Michael Chen watching 23 years of work collapse because trucks can't cross the border efficiently anymore. It's social workers like Jennifer Okoye trying to provide dignity and support to families with resources that ran out before the crisis even started. Second, understand the scale of what we're facing. This isn't about 11,000 unauthorized crossings that were happening before. Security analysts project 75,000 to 120,000 people crossing the northern border in the next year. Border communities are facing sustained pressure that will require billions in federal support that isn't currently budgeted. We're talking about transforming infrastructure, operations, and community services across 12.3 million Americans who live in northern border regions. Third, recognize the permanent consequences that most people aren't seeing yet. Once you fracture a 70-year security partnership, you don't easily restore it. We're not just losing cooperative border management. We're losing the foundation of continental security cooperation that has prevented countless crises, enabled unprecedented trade integration, and made North America one of the most secure regions in the world. If you found this breakdown valuable, make sure you're subscribed because this story is evolving rapidly, and I'll be tracking every development as it unfolds. Here's what keeps me up at night. We're not just losing border security cooperation, we're losing something far more valuable: the basic assumption that the United States and Canada are natural allies with aligned interests and shared destinies. And once that assumption is gone, no amount of money, no future agreement, no diplomatic reset will fully restore what we're watching collapse right now.